reflections on self-discipline. It's not a authoritative or comprehensive discussion of self-discipline, but simply one student's thoughts on the subject, and hopefully there will be questions after we're done, and there will be large portions of the subject that we don't get to cover. Now, I don't know what just happened there, but what did happen, Jonathan? My screen changed, and I don't know how it changed. But I guess we kind of go with what we have.
Zoom or plus?
You can zoom in.
There we go. Let's try that again, see what happened. And yeah, self-discipline is one of those kinds of subjects I think we all kind of wish we knew more about, but don't know what to do about. And I suppose the best way to start is to look for a couple of maybe working definitions. What is the self? What am I? What's a human being? Regardless of our particular perceptions, there's something about being human and being able to perceive the world. I think largely humans perceive the world not just through our senses, but through our minds. And this is, I think, an important lesson we learn in theosophy, that we are essentially mind beings. We're thinking beings. And our conceptions of ourselves make a lot of difference about the world. If we, for example, think of ourselves as just material things or biological entities, then our interaction with the world is largely going to be as material beings and as biological entities. If we think of ourselves as creatures of God and somehow the puppets of some fate, then we'll probably behave somewhat accordingly. So our conception of the self is both essential to our own understanding, but also essential to how we apply that understanding to the world. And the other term, discipline, is one of those kind of awkward terms with a lot of baggage. For a lot of people, discipline means giving up something. There's something that I want more than all the things I want to give up. So it could, and for a lot of people, that's something like a monk or a nun living in a monastery, drinking water and eating dry bread. For others, it perhaps brings to mind the work of an athlete that's able to focus really hard on her skill. Say it's a high school athlete that really wants to become a professional. Well, she's going to give up something. She'll give up time with friends, relationships, social encounters, and so forth, perhaps some academic work, in order to work on the game. And so we have all sorts of modern analogs or examples, you could say, of self-discipline. And every person probably comes up with his or her own sort of working definitions. But if we only think of it as something we have to give up, then perhaps we've oversimplified it. And what's the downside of oversimplifying any subject? Well, with this one, it could be that we oversimplify or over-personalize the idea of discipline. Then we end up with either external discipline or no discipline. External discipline is perhaps exemplified by religious constraints. Thou shalt or thou shalt not. A set of rules, external guidelines that we need to follow to meet some sort of arbitrary external standard. Another problem is we have that of selective control. That is, we only control that part of our lives that is subject to the discipline. So the athlete, for example, may not do very well in social circumstances or interactions with other people because he's entirely focused on the craft, entirely focused on developing certain kinds of skills. And perhaps the other sort of we could say a distraction would be things like the fears that we face. So many human beings, we gauge our lives largely often on the things we're afraid of or the things that we want to avoid. So you have the problem of fear and the problem of pain. And those are different aspects that are impacted by how we see ourselves as selves, as beings, as humans, but also our ideas of what human progress is. And so what I thought we'd do today is look at kind of three aspects of this subject, because I thought, well, self-discipline needs to have a basis. So I thought there were three kind of complementary terms that might be helpful here. Self-reliance, self-control, and self-discipline. Now, these seem to be related to each other, but not exactly the same thing. And I sort of thought of them as sort of complementary ideas, we could say, that would all be helpful to understand kind of this idea of reflecting on self-discipline. So I kind of thought, well, there's several ways we could approach that, and we talked about. Let's just start with self-reliance, and I think that one of the best places to look and just kind of to get a broader perspective to start was, I think it's from Blavatsky's Voice of the Silence, but I could be wrong, attributed to the Buddha. Look inward, thou art Buddha. Now, this kind of sets the stage and sort of gives us a different kind of direction to self-discipline. Because first of all, it's inwardly directed. It's not directed toward norms or other people or society standards or whatever it might be. It also reinforces a really useful concept of self. Because the Buddha, if we were to say, could we imagine the best kind of human being? A lot of people would probably point to the Buddhas, the Christs, the Lao Tzus, the Krishnas of history, those great religious traditions. So there's that idea of self as being this really universal individual, if you will, or to do it in sort of popular terms, a universal person. What is the most universal person we could imagine? So that ideal sort of stands behind the kind of this whole concept of self-discipline, because it's internally focused. So we're all familiar with probably the famous lines from Shakespeare's Hamlet. This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night to day, the day. Thou canst not then be false to any man. Now, Shakespeare is a genius here, because the guy who gives this advice, Polonius in Hamlet, to his son Laertes, doesn't follow the advice at all. I mean, he eventually goes and does exactly the opposite of what it means. But Shakespeare uses him kind of as a foil to really say something profound. And that is, be true to oneself. If you're true to yourself, then you're not going to be false to anybody. The way Polonius has it, though, he's basically telling his son, look after number one. Look after yourself. When you go to Paris, make sure you don't let anybody fool you. And if you don't do that, then you're going to be okay. Be true to yourself, and you're going to do well in the world. Well, Shakespeare knows both how the world sees things and how perhaps what we see needs to grow. And so he's inculcating a wider idea. And that wider idea is a better idea of the self. To be true to oneself, that means something different to every individual. And I think Shakespeare is onto something, because he by implication, the rest of Hamlet is that don't pay attention to what this guy does, pay attention to what I'm telling you. And here again, it's a way of introducing an ethical kind of standard, if you will, a principle of action. And Shakespeare is really good at doing this, because he's turning the whole idea of self-reliance on its head, if you will, from most people's perspective, and hinting at something deeper. Now, the person that kind of really got it and made it something deeper was, a few hundred years after Shakespeare, the name of Ralph Waldo Emerson. He's got a wonderful essay called Self-Reliance. And in that essay, there's some of the most famous things that he says. Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. I mean, that's really, oops, sorry about that. What did I do? Hello. How did I lose this? There we are. Sorry about that. And then the famous thing about what other people think. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines. With consistency, a great soul has simply nothing to do. So Emerson takes this idea of self-reliance to a deeper level. He's saying, rely on yourself, but understand that idea of yourself is something that is not what the world thinks it is. It's not external. And he says, nothing can bring you peace but yourself. Nothing can bring you peace but the triumph of principles. So now he's taken it to yet a different level. Now it's about principles. What are our principles? Helps us define what we are, what we think we are, our idea of self. It also gives us perhaps some hints about what self-reliance is and maybe what self-control might be and what self-discipline could be. And the implications, Emerson gets the implications of this kind of idea because he says it's easy to see that a greater self-reliance, a new respect for the divinity of man must work a revolution in all the offices and relations of men, in their religion, in their education, in their pursuits, their modes of living, their associations, in their property, in their speculative views. Well, what are we doing here? Speculative views, you could say. But that idea of self-reliance, internally focused on something based on principles, is a better basis for action than what the world thinks it ought to be or what we ought to do. So Emerson gives it, like I say, a different kind of level. And now, we get into another kind of an element. And here, Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita gives us some hints because his disciple, his pupil, Arjuna, learns from Krishna that he needs to focus his mind. There's been 4 or 5 chapters, 6 chapters in the Gita where Krishna is giving some instruction about yoga. And a lot of that is about focusing the mind. And Arjuna takes our position that most of us have that, hey, the mind's like the wind. It's just really hard to control and it's restless and I don't know if I can control it. Krishna just says, well, and I can't read it all here because somehow it doesn't, I don't know if it will allow me to make it. Now I can, there we go. Just change the screen size a little bit. Depends on which side of the slide or the PDF the quotation is. Yeah, I got it. And Krishna says, by practice, what you do is you just keep trying. And when your mind flies off to something that you didn't mean it to be on, bring it back and practice doing that. This kind of gets into that next level, we could say, of beyond self-reliance. Now we're talking about maybe controlling where our minds go. We go back to what we introduced with and say, well, why does that matter? Well, take the athlete that's totally focused on the sport. Well, maybe there's a need to apply that discipline to other aspects of life. Maybe there's a need to focus ourselves on principles and ideals and figure out, maybe at least attempt to put those into practice. So Krishna is a genius. Bhagavad Gita is genius at giving hints to us about how to apply principles of self-reliance, of self-control, and self-discipline. We turn to Blavatsky's Voice of the Silence. And early in the work, she says, well, before the soul can comprehend and may remember, we can say, well, really, before we can really learn how to focus our minds, she must unto the silent speaker be united, just as the form to which the clay is modeled is first united with the potter's mind. Now, here with this image, is this great imagery of the potter's wheel and clay. And you notice the hands here in the center of the wheel, it's a view of a ceramist starting the formation of a pot, something on a potter's wheel. First thing that has to happen is that lump of clay has to get beaten down, mashed together, but it has to be centered so that the center of the wheel becomes the focus of the potter's attention. And that kind of focus as a metaphor for soul, which is our essential awareness, we could say, and the idea of that silent speaker, which is, and by implication, that better part of us, the part of us that recognizes principles, and that it's important to be able to apply those principles in our daily lives. And so she says that the clay is modeled and is first united with the potter's mind. So there's a thinking about that centering process that's kind of a metaphor for meditation. And that's kind of, I think, where she goes with The Voice of the Silence, which is a master treatise on meditation. And it's a kind of a different subject, but I think, well, I'll tell you what, let's go with the way I had it sort of laid out here. Because she adds another element to it about the mind. And here, this is more along the line of controlling the mind, but also with a deeper implication. She says the mind is like a mirror. It gathers dust while it reflects. It needs this gentle breezes of soul wisdom to brush away the dust of our illusions. Seek, O beginner, to blend thy mind and soul. So what is she getting at? Getting at this idea, perhaps, that the mind is a tool and that the soul, the perceiver, is that which uses the tool the same way the mind itself uses the brain as a tool and the brain uses the body as a vehicle. But it's that inner perception of ourselves, that application of the power to perceive, that I think she tries to get at in The Voice of the Silence. And a complementary tool, we could say, for this idea of self-control is that masterwork on meditation, the yoga aphorisms of Patanjali. And here we have this wonderful definition of concentration. He calls it yoga, as hindering the modifications of the thinking principle. Now, this is kind of, I'd say, the ultimate of control of the mind. What are the modifications of the thinking principle? They're everything we think we are that isn't us. It's all the illusions that we have about the self. It goes back to that conception of what is the perceiver, what is the self, all these kinds of questions. What is the mind? What is soul? These are not just questions to be answered with finality, but they are directions of intent, directions for kind of hints at the kinds of meditations, and also a way to kind of understand ourselves. It's all about understanding ourselves and what our own capacities are, and perhaps ultimately what it is we ought to be doing as human beings. And that is, how do we apply these principles in practical life? There's another aspect that Patanjali has. But I didn't get a chance to make a slide for it, and where he says that the soul is the perceiver, looks directly on ideas. It's vision itself and looks directly on ideas. That's what mind does. We look at ideas. We want a definition of mind. Think of it as that aspect of ourselves, whatever our definition is, that considers ideas. And so it has to do with our self-conception. It has to do with our perceptions of others. It has to do with how we see ourselves, we say, as part of the world or not part of the world. And Patanjali suggests 3 tools. And they're not easy tools, but they're possible ones. And they're really tools for this thing we could call self-discipline. And remember, self-discipline is not something by itself. I think it has at least the aspects of self-control and self-reliance kind of attached to it, like essential components, you could say. And the first, he says, he calls it the ability to fix the mind on a place, an object, or a subject. That's attention. And he uses a Sanskrit term, which is useful to know, dharana. Dharana is simply that ability to pay attention to something for more than about a fifth of a second. Paying attention to something. And we have to do that to do anything. The athlete who's trying to learn how to really become a good basketball player has to pay attention to the basket and the ball and for more than just a fraction of a second. There has to be a concentration there. So it's a focusing of the mind first and attention for just a brief period, maybe a brief period of time. We want to learn to do anything. What do we tell children? Hey, pay attention. We need to tell ourselves the same thing. Pay attention. So potentially goes a little farther and he says, well, if you keep at it, we could call this contemplation. He says it's the Sanskrit term dhyana. It's a nice term to know. Probably has a lot more in its spelling and implications in Sanskrit that I have any idea of, but it's a kind of a useful term. And paying attention for any period of time, he's saying, is contemplation. And that's a way, a kind of self-discipline. To be able to do that for any period of time is a self-discipline. And then he says, well, when you can practice it in respect to, say, a particular object for any prolonged period of time, he calls it meditation. So that's a working definition, we could say, of meditation. It's not everybody's working definition, but it's a helpful one. It's a good place to start. And quite frankly, for a lot of us, it's about as far as we get. If we can pay attention for something for a little while and truly think continue our attention to it, they could say, well, that's a kind of meditation. It's very useful. The more we practice this, perhaps we could say, like Krishna says, you have to bring your mind back time and time again. We get a little better at it, and he potentially calls it another term, another useful term, samyama. Samyama is what happens when we pay attention, contemplate something for a period of time, and really understand. We put our mind in sync with the object, kind of like Blavatsky says when she's talking about uniting the mind and soul, like the mind to the clay. We become one with that medium and with that environment, and so that continuing contemplation he calls samyama. And you find this. I mean, this is pretty basic stuff. I think if you can look up, meditation, or look up these terms in any book on yoga of any sort that refers to Patanjali, and you'll find these terms. I mean, they're really useful and they're incredibly useful terms, but they don't always tell us everything. They have to be applied, and I think that's kind of the lesson that comes out of this whole subject of self-discipline, is that we can read about it, hear about it, hear talk on it, maybe hear something we hadn't heard before, or maybe it's just something we've always heard or heard many times. But until we spend some time doing, it's secondhand knowledge. And if anything, Theosophy teaches not to accept secondhand knowledge. What is Blavatsky's third fundamental proposition? It's all about self-induced and self-devised efforts. Other people's efforts are really useful. They may be helpful to us. They may be helpful to others. Our efforts might be helpful to others. But the work that we do on ourselves, we have to do. Nobody else can do that for us. So Patanjali goes a lot further than simply attention, contemplation, concentration, and meditation, and full, you'd say, full understanding. And he says that there's a point where that whole process gets us focused. All those three aspects become united in one. You could say those three of attention, contemplation, concentration, and the meditation all become aspect of one thing. And he calls it ekagrata. Eka, one, grata, point, I think is how it's technically termed. But one pointedness takes us back to the center of the wheel, back to the center of the clay, one could say. And something really magical happens, apparently. So the wise sages tell us, when we do that, we're not only one-pointed, we're also universally pointed. So it's not just 3 in 1, it's 1 in 3. And those 3 aspects are different aspects, you could say, of this whole process of understanding self-reliance, self-control, and self-discipline. They are really the attention, contemplation, concentration aspects. And there is a necessary transcendence of anything that we learn. The way Blavatsky puts it, I didn't put the quote here, but she puts it that in The Secret Doctrine, that the upward progress of the ego is a series of progressive awakenings. And each time we think we've got something figured out, we kind of plateau. And when we plateau, that's fine. We work with that insight, you could say, that progressive awakening, and eventually it fades. It's not sufficient because it's not totally universal. It seems universal to us. It seems perhaps genius. I think we really figured something out, but we really haven't. We've simply reached another, you could say, another milestone, a little marker like here, that tells us that although we might be headed in a useful direction, we're certainly not done. We're not to the point where we've become Buddha, certainly not. We're not even perhaps where Arjuna is, totally understanding on, perhaps have some understanding on how to focus the mind, how to control it. But at least we've begun the journey. It's a worthwhile journey to try to reach, to understand what the implications are of these things, of self-reliance, self-control, and self-discipline. So there's kind of a necessary transcendent aspect of whatever we do, of whatever we understand in self-discipline. Going back to the athlete example, the really best athletes transcend their sports. They get to the point where what they do is so automatic that there's an absolute grace and beauty to the actions. Now, it's limited to that sport. It's limited to that particular field. But when you see a basketball player practically make 30-foot jump shots, 3-pointers, and barely make an effort, it seems. It's totally effortless. But the same kind of effortlessness one can see in superb mountain climbers. You can see it in Zen masters. You can see it in Hapkido masters from Korea. You can see it where everything that they do is so focused and yet so relaxed that they're totally in sync with their environment, within the confines of the sport. It truly becomes a universal expression of this idea of true self-discipline in its particular area. Now, it's the challenge then for us to understand how that lesson can get applied, how we can apply that to all aspects of our lives. And that's kind of the real challenge of this sort of subject, is that it's only by implication and paying attention to our own thinking, our own minds, that we really get any place. That's true in either sports or in our relationships or in society, amongst nations. These are all tools that we can apply in a kind of, we could call it a perfection of yoga, a kind of transcendent aspect of human experience. That it's possible. We have many of the examples that we've referred to here of individuals that truly transcend their age. Shakespeare is still current 400 years later. Emerson, people still read. Patanjali, a couple thousand years at least, people still read the Yoga Sutras. The ideas that Blavatsky pointed out in The Secret Doctrine are not things that she invented. They're things that she's pointing to that are absolutely timeless. They're part of all the religious traditions, and yet they are essential to our understanding of the world. But we have to seek those ideas out and apply them ourselves. It takes effort to do that. So we've kind of hinted at some of the tools that we might use for self-reliance and self-discipline. It's really self-control. These are kind of like the beginning points. But we go back to the ideal of the Buddha. And the Buddha did that and talked about that. Looking inward, thou art Buddha, not because he wanted people to, do what he did. He wanted to show a path that every human being could follow. Blavatsky calls the Buddha the efflorescence of an age. Buddha represents that pinnacle for our period of evolution, the perfection of human evolution, of human consciousness. But a friend of mine noted a while back, and I'm not sure who said it, but it might have been attributed to the Dalai Lama. A lot of American Buddhists want to become Buddhists, and people want to become Buddhists, natural kind of thing. But he said, what we really need is people that want to become Buddha. There's a big difference, but it's a difference in focus, because the Buddha represents not just a perfected human being, but a human being entirely devoted to the service of humanity. That's what's needed if we're going to transcend all the minor and petty, outwardly directed kinds of self-reliance and self-control and self-discipline that we're surrounded with. This is only symptoms of much deeper problem. And it's really, it represents the challenge and the wonderful opportunity of what it means to be human. So, if you stay with me this long, I just a couple of closing thoughts. What do we get out of any kind of application of self-discipline? Perhaps we get some kind of ability to pay attention to something for more than a minute or two. Perhaps we gain the ability to watch our own thoughts, to pay attention and think about what it is we really need as opposed to what we think we want. And an opportunity to understand what it is that we, as humans, we ought to be doing. What are the things that are best for humans to be doing? And not just for everybody else. We start with ourselves. And whatever ideal that we have, we certainly can try to embody it and exemplify it as best we can, but also to include others in that kind of vision. And I think that's the use and the wonderful value of these kinds of meetings, is that it's an invitation to examine ideas and to examine our own first principles. That's why I think Blavatsky starts with her works, often kind of enumerating things, or ends the work with certain principles that she'd like us to pay attention to. Not that they're final answers, but they are useful, you would say, metaphors or tools or analogs for ideas that we then develop and work with in our own minds, in our own lives. Because theosophy is not yet another religion to be believed or not believed. It's not one to be coerced in anyone's sense of having to accept ideas that we think are useful. It's, I think, a challenge to try to demonstrate the best ideas and ideals that we can. And hopefully there are, because these ideas also resonate in many, in all human beings. They're just buried. They're buried in what we think we are and what we think we want. And so it's a challenge to transcend and try to do better, find a better perspective than what the culture around us tells us we ought to do. And we all absorb a lot of oughts from our culture. And the question is, are those useful? Are they universal? Do they make us more compassionate, more willing to serve, more willing to help, and more aware of ourselves or less? And that's a decision and a kind of a choice that every human being eventually has to make for oneself. So I'm going to stop. Hopefully, Jonathan can figure out how others can speak. What do I do, Jonathan? Take off my screen share. I can do that. Stop screen share. You can figure that part out. All right.
Once you have them do a sound check to see, have somebody ask you a question, and then I would like to see how much we can hear it in the auditorium here.
Okay. Well, I don't know if Jonathan could hear what he said. So does anybody have a question that would like to ask, just as a kind of a start, a sound check here? We want to know who can be heard. Maluka, I see a hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Wesley, lovely, very inspiring. You mentioned Buddhism and that we should be a Buddha and all that, and I think it's absolutely true. I was listening not too long ago the Dalai Lama. He was saying that intellect without the heart warmness is not good. He said it makes a lot of troublemakers. And then he also talked about that we have to control the monkey brain. I was wondering what you have to say about that.
I think the Dalai Lama is on to something. Controlling the monkey brain, which is the monkey. What is that? I mean, it's not the brain connected to the sort of the brain, the brain cell, that the stem that controls our reactions and controls our things we like and things we don't like, and so forth. Our preferences. You can say it's for us. It's Kama-Manas. It's mind focused in desires. The thing about the monkey is he's not quite aware of what he knows or what he wants. We're doing things. Certainly, a sentient being. The thing with human beings is that we have both the monkey mind and we have the higher faculties. We have the ability to choose. We can choose if we work at it, we can choose our actions, our thoughts, our values, but it takes work. So Blavatsky makes the distinction between the psychic and the noetic. The psychic is the monkey mind. That's the mind that's driven by what it likes, what it doesn't like. And we all have that. The thing is, what do we do with the noetic aspect? What do we do with the higher capacities to make choices? I don't know if that answers the question, Maluka, but it's a start. If anybody has something to add, I'd be very willing to listen.
That was good. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Anybody trying to speak and I'm not hearing here, or there's a hand. Maurice or Jenny?
Yes.
Well,
thank you, Wes, for your presentation. It brought up a lot of issues, I think. So just to begin with, all of this then has to do with self-awareness, and really the revolution that, in a sense, we're all going through, individually and collectively, seems to be one of self-awareness. And suffering has a lot to do with opening up that self-awareness. So could you say a little bit more about the role of pain and suffering and maybe karma in terms of opening up the self-awareness so we get to the point of self-reliance and self-control? Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Excellent question there, Maurice. Yeah, what do we do about all the pain? The Buddha had at least a partial answer for it. First of all, acknowledge it. Say it's a part of the human condition. and everything that we go through is going to have a level of discomfort or pain associated with it, because it's always going to be incomplete. And so, you can sort of describe that human condition, but perhaps it's also a great teacher. Pain and difficulty are, you could say, the sand in the oyster. It's what gets us to grow pearls. And we don't have at least some grit in us, some sand, then we'll never grow the pearls. That's a kind of a crude analogy, but maybe it's a place we can start from. Yeah. And we absolutely have to take it in the larger context, and you've implied karma, certainly karma and reincarnation, because all the sand in the oyster is not, we didn't put it all there in one lifetime. There's a lot that's kind of, we might call it residual sand. A lot of difficulty that humans encounter in life isn't something that they created in one lifetime. So it won't be something that's worked out in just one lifetime. But it takes a larger perspective, and pain perhaps is one of those ways in which we learn from life that whatever we're doing may not be a complete path. It may be self-destructive, but it's also an opportunity. And so how we treat that and what we think we are, our idea of self, and even our idea of self-discipline will have a lot to do with how we deal with all that pain, all of that difficulty.
Yeah, thank you.
Laura, you're welcome. Laura, there's a hand. Go ahead.
Yes. Well, you talked about, of course, self-discipline. And we can only control or discipline an aspect of ourselves if we're aware of it. And so you mentioned that one way we become aware of it is through pain. We become aware that there is something that we need to learn how to use or manage within us, some kind of discipline that has to take place. But at the beginning of your talk, you also mentioned the idea of having a goal, like the woman who wants to be an athlete. And the goal seems to be part of what helps us to be aware of what aspects of our nature need to be disciplined. So we kind of learn a self-awareness as well. So could you maybe expand on the idea of the importance of having a goal or a vision, or that idea of thou art Buddha, as was mentioned in your talk? That maybe that is what helps us to be conscious of what needs to be disciplined.
Thank you, Laura. I think you put your finger on it. Goals are really important. Blavatsky's understanding, where she says that the progress of the ego is a series of progressive awakenings. That's a series of progressive goals. That's understanding that the goal we work for is only a step. It's not the end all. It's not the be all. It's the same way she makes the distinction between relative and absolute truth. Absolute truth is always beyond the horizon. It's always something beyond our reach. Doesn't mean we can't reach toward it. And it doesn't mean there isn't an aspect of ourselves which is already the Buddha, if you will. But we have to understand that those goals will, even though if we reach them or if we don't, no matter what we reach, there will always be further goals. The Buddha reached a pinnacle of development, what Blavatsky called the efflorescence of an age, and yet there must be Buddhas beyond Gautama Buddha. There must be other spiritual beings that have progressed far beyond. Those higher spiritual beings, Dhyani Buddhas, or whatever we want to call them, those are the future horizon for spiritual evolution. But they may be totally out of our reach. It's always useful to have goals that we can reach. Just be aware that they are temporary and won't always be completely fulfilling. But they're still important. They're really important. They just have to be understood with a perspective.
Thank you. Thank you, Wes.
Yeah, sure. Ken, I say.
Yes, Wes. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed that immensely. And several people have mentioned the quote you mentioned from the Dalai Lama about American Buddhists want to be Buddhists, but Dalai Lama says, well, actually, they should be aiming to be Buddhas in the sense of wanting to serve humanity. One thing that I grapple with in my own kind of vehicle of Ken that I'm living in is the idea of if I go ahead and say that even in a group of theosophists, am I sounding or am I coming across as being egotistical or narcissistic? And so it's like, how do I get enough, how shall I say, separation from the little s self so that I can move in that Buddhahood direction and not feel like I'm on the path of self-aggrandizement. I want my name written in gold letters on the top of a tall building. And so it's like, how do I say I want to become a Buddha and move in that path and yet avoid, stepping into the mire of narcissism and getting my foot stuck on the ladder that she talks about in The Voice of the Silence. If I'm looking downwards, I won't get further on that path. Any thoughts about that?
Oh, great question. Yeah, we'll probably all get stuck in the mire at some point. That's just part of being willing to take a journey. And we're willing to risk climbing a mountain. We probably risk getting lost in the forest, getting stuck on a cliff somewhere, or being stuck in the swamp before we start going uphill. So yeah, that's the risk that we take. We are self-defining beings. And as such, we're distinct from the other kingdoms. Their nature is pretty well set. We need to determine what our nature is, and we have both the lower vehicle and the higher aspirations. And we often don't understand what the difference is between the two. But having that ideal, having that kind of goal, at least hints to us that it's possible. And that there's a direction that's worthwhile going in. And think about it, our personalities, they don't survive. We are whatever our name is, the Ken or the Wes or whoever. That's not going to be there. Perhaps you could say it's the very last personality that we have that merges with its highest self and becomes the Buddha. But as long as we think of ourselves as the person and not as the individual, then maybe we're going to have we'll often and probably for a long time have an incomplete idea of self. But it's the kind of thing, a kind of view that can grow. A person can see themselves as as part of a family. Well, a family is a larger unit, as part of a nation, or as a part of a culture or civilization. Those are all useful perspectives. They're not complete in and of themselves, but they are really useful to have as kind of, temporary goals. And so as long as we understand our personalities as we know ourselves is a temporary tool. Maybe we just keep that in mind, and it will help us keep some balance when we do get stuck in the swamp. I don't know how to answer, because I think we all get stuck in the swamp. So, David, hi. You, sure can. Thank you. Go ahead, David. David, can't hear you. I think your microphone.
Now I can unmute.
There you are.
Sorry about
Thank
that.
you. All right. Hi, David. Hi.
How can we? I was thinking. Of course, you presented the ideas so well about self-reliance, and each of us have to walk the walk for ourselves, so to speak. But at the same time, there's such a focus in our society on individualism. And even the idea of self-reliance is, it just makes me think of HPD's statement about the dire heresy of our time is separateness. So I'm wondering, how can we do these disciplines yet kind of shift into more carrying with us the vision that we're all in this together, that we're really all evolving together. that none of us get that far past the race mind, so to speak, because we're all doing it together. So what can we carry with us to have that perception as we go along day to day?
Yeah,
that the people we see on the street, we might disagree with in some ways, but actually, how do we cultivate interdependence? Let's put it that way.
Yeah,
I know it's difficult.
Yeah, it is a hard question. I don't know it. I'm standing at a podium here in San Diego. I really don't know. But it's a question worth asking, and perhaps the fact that we ask it at all tells us it's possible to have a different perspective. So we acknowledge that there can be a different perspective. Then we look for maybe examples. And we look at the idea of the Buddha or of any great teacher and say, well, there's an example that it's worth paying attention to. We probably can't do what they did, but we don't have to do what they did. We need to kind of turn in the direction that they've indicated. And maybe that's about the best that we can do is turn in that more universal direction a little bit at a time through self-reliance, through self-control, through self-discipline of some sort, and do the best that we can based on the highest ideals that we can find. Plato in his dialogues often are all about some great principle. What is truth? What is justice? Oh, what is love? What is courage? And he often, as Socrates gets replies from people, Socrates is the one who asks all the questions, the gadfly that he is or was. And what he gets is examples. He gets examples of courage or love or justice or truth. But he doesn't, when he asks for courage, he gets somebody, well, so-and-so was very courageous when they rescued, people from the ship, or this person was very courageous in battle. It never gets to the point where it's fully defined. It's simply indicated as a higher value. And so we try to find those higher values in ourselves, in those around us, in the ideas that we take in or don't take in, and try to follow the highest path we can, knowing that whatever we follow it's going to be incomplete, and that's okay, because as long as we recognize it's not the final goal, it's a useful goal, and just being aware of those distinctions, I think, might keep us from a certain amount of cynicism about this sort of path, and just kind of, well, maybe I shouldn't try because it's just too much. And there are so many examples of things that are worthwhile, and we probably should try to avoid being too discouraged by, as you say, the circumstances and the noise that surround us so much. I hope that's a helpful.
Yeah, good ideas. Yeah.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Check. Can you guys hear me? Pretty soft.
Barely.
Okay.
Can anybody hear Jonathan? He's across the room from me, and he wants a sound check. Can people hear what he's saying?
Not well.
Not well. Okay. Come on up.
Now I'm going to do another sound check. Can you hear me now?
Now can you hear it?
Better.
Okay.
All right. Well, why don't I just come over here really close then?
There you go.
How about now?
All right. Now.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, much
very
better.
clearly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Very
okay.
good.
Okay. So this is my question. I was wondering if you could relate kind of caring, which I think is this interdependent thing, with self-discipline. I'm thinking of two examples where if a person is responsible for other people, and in that case, the stakes are high. The first example is with a mother getting a couple of kids across the street and not letting them run away,
right? But
trying to be gentle. And she knows that the stakes are high and she's got to concentrate no matter what they're doing, right? Okay, another example would be like an airline pilot.
Mm-hmm.
He's got to have self-discipline, or she. she's got to look at all the instrument panel, just all the procedures, not be distracted. Stakes are high, and there's, by definition, there's a lot of care here.
Right.
And I was just wondering if you could connect those two ideas, care and self-discipline.
Care and self-discipline. I'm sure we can make some connections there. Interesting about the mother crossing the street with her children. There's a kind of necessary external discipline. You can't just let 5-year-olds run loose. It's not responsible. So in that case, caring means not allowing a lot of individual choice to a very young child. But if that's a 15-year-old child, one might have to exercise that stewardship, if you will, in different terms. It may still be stewardship, but by 15, people start to make their own choices and have to live with their consequences. Now, you don't want them to live with all the choices of all the consequences of all of their choices, but there are some consequences you let them live with. If they're playing with dynamite, you might want to stop them regardless of what their age is. So that sometimes external discipline is necessary. But for adults, that external discipline needs to be transformed somehow into internal discipline. So now the internal discipline, the care that the airline pilot has for the 300 people on the airplane, that's a different order of self-reliance, of self-control, and of self-discipline. Because now they really have to pay attention. And it's attention based on the needs of others, not their own personal needs right at that moment. And so that kind of transcendence is a great example of how we can use higher faculties than what we might use in other circumstances. It shows that those higher faculties are part of human capacities. They can be developed. Airline capacity, the airline pilot that doesn't develop those capacities is not a very good pilot and should not be piloting airplanes, especially not those full of other people. So it's one of those kinds of things where it takes discrimination to know when to discipline, when not to, and always to show as much care as is appropriate. Because if you show too much care to the teenager, they'll rebel. They don't want those constraints. But there's a certain balance about what makes, I guess, teenage years especially difficult, because there's a certain balance between how much you need to control for them and how much you have to let them kind of make their own mistakes. So a lot of what ifs in human affairs, as it seems to be appropriate. So I hope that was enough of a start of an answer.
Thank you.
Sure.
Another question, Elena.
Go ahead, Elena, please.
Hi, Wes. Thank you so much for your talk. And I've got an easy question for you. Haha. Ready?
Finally, I took my mute. Thank you.
Finally, an easy question. So, we take care of a lot of people in our lives, all of us do. And I was thinking along the lines of addiction and mental illness. Sometimes it seems like we draw a line in the sand and we say, we want you to be self-reliant, but they really can't be, and I think society as a whole still doesn't realize that it's sometimes just not possible for people to be 100% self-reliant when they're faced with those kinds of challenges. So what might be, theosophically helpful about thinking along those terms?
Thank you, Elena. It's a great question. While it's clear what's appropriate for children, it's not always clear what's appropriate for adults in our relationships in terms of caring and so forth. The old adage, the road to hell being paved with good intentions has a validity. You can overmanage the care of others. And so, might not be appropriate. At other times, we just don't know how much care to give. So if you're talking about caring for someone else, depends upon the relationship. It depends upon the ages. It depends upon that person's ability to care for themselves. It depends on our ability to help. We may not have the tools to help. We may not know how to help. It may be that someone else needs to be consulted, whether it's a medical doctor or I don't know, someone else in the community that could be useful. Is part of the challenge of being human is to know when and how to act. And most of us, unfortunately, we learn a lot after we've done it, and we call it conscience, or we call it oops, or whatever description we might have. We find out that in that situation, in that relationship, we tried too hard or didn't try hard enough, and we beat ourselves up about it. Sometimes appropriately, largely not. So it really is a balanced kind of thing, and it goes back to that wonderful characteristic of human beings is that we have to sometimes make our own mistakes, but we sometimes also have to help others not make those mistakes. And again, it requires discrimination, judgment in the very best sense that we could use either term. And I guess that's just one way of saying there's no simple answers, and there's no formula by which one could say, well, theosophically, we ought to do. It goes back to that first distinction we made about where the self-reliance is based. Is it based on what other people think we ought to do? Is it somehow externally based? Or do we kind of make our own decisions? It depends on who it affects, and it depends on what our abilities are. A lot of variables in human affairs. And I don't know how else to attempt an answer on that.
No, that was great. Thanks, Wes.
And you told me it was going to be an easy question.
It is. You nailed it.
There are no easy questions, and even fewer easy answers. So, Kirk, please go ahead. Kirk, I see a hand. Go ahead, Kirk.
Oh, sorry about that. Wes, I'm one of those who enjoyed your presentation very much. It was given very naturally, someone who's obviously been with the philosophy for many years. And it's like it flowed very naturally and also with depth, as you built upon it. And I just wondered if you would touch on one other point in regards to self-discipline, which Judge brings up, and that is the importance of, particularly in the practice of meditation, which you went into some detail about, setting aside a specific time and place for that more interior practice, which he speaks of two different types of meditation, of course, one which is continuous, and the other which we set aside a specific time. But he also points to, the importance that if you do something at the same time each day, you develop a rhythm in which the mind then tends to incline to go in that direction at that specific time. And that actually the space also in which one attempts to do such a practice starts to participate in the elemental field that one is creating by attempting to, raise thought to a higher level at a concentrated level. So I just wondered about the importance of, regularity in terms of time and place that one practices discipline.
Thank you, Kirk. I appreciate that. And it's an aspect of self-discipline I didn't even attempt to touch. It has a lot to do with, we could say, well, the practical mechanics of inner observation. Kind of how do we practice meditation? And so it's really useful, which you've pointed out, being able to do something at the same time every day brings back the memories of doing that, not just our conscious memories, but our entire bodies. Take the athlete, girl practicing to become a better basketball player. She practices at the same time of day, maybe it's for a couple of hours, and does it regularly. There's a value to that. We quite literally train the lives of our bodies to be responsive to what we have in mind. And so by training our bodies, we train by also training all the environment around us. And so we're training we call the elementals, the little lives, not just to the body, but literally the air around us, the atmosphere. The term I think today is the vibe that we exude. All of that is really useful and important. And I'm really glad you pointed it out. It's almost an essential part of that periodic kind of meditation. As far as the other sort, the life meditation, well, that's the sort of thing that we develop because of what we paid attention to, not just in those specific time frames, but also throughout our lives. What are the values that we hold, and how much attention do we pay to the things that are of somehow of some lasting value, and how much do we pay attention to the things that are totally, you might say, irrelevant to living a better life. Those are individual decisions, but the consequences are probably pretty profound, as you've indicated, and I appreciate you bringing those up. It's a subject for much deeper consideration than we have time for today, and I wouldn't pretend to have any more than just a superficial understanding of those components. But thanks for a great question.
Thanks for your response.
Jonathan says we have time for one more question. Is there another question in the house?
Well, I'll just add one other comment, Wes, to your comments, and that is that the other problem that most of us face at one point or another in trying to implement a discipline is sustaining it over time, right? There's a kind of a sourness creeps in, a lack of luster, it becomes more drudgery. We think, oh, well, there's something really better I could be doing, something more practical, or whatever. There's this tendency that creeps in that the grass will be greener somewhere else. And so that the issue of trying to cultivate a discipline that one can sustain over years and decades, because that's really where the fruit, it seems, starts to emerge, is really after many years of practice, and the discipline deepens and deepens further, that then some type of real fruition that can be of benefit to others begins to emerge. So it's that question of how to not lose enthusiasm for the practice, and to keep it something that's very living and a real sense of the deepness of the value of it. How do you do that?
Wonderful observation and great question. Honestly, I wish I knew. To be honest, it's one of those questions that, first of all, it's hard to answer for anybody else, but we can perhaps make some suggestions. William Q. Judge in his Ocean of Theosophy, suggests that the nature of the mind is to fly off the things that are pleasant, unpleasant, or to sit still and not do anything. And so there is a natural return of impression when those things that distract us come back. And as Krishna suggests, we just practice. We have to bring minds back, and if we have a kind of, say, a depression or a sense that we're not getting anywhere, then maybe we have to reevaluate and start a new cycle. Take advantage of that return of impression and follow it with something positive. It's not easy, as Krishna points out, but it can be done. So maybe we just need to recognize that those things will happen, that they are probably not just natural, but also maybe inevitable, it's not an easy path. And so we can go back to kind of the whole ideal of the Buddha and say, well, those great ones did it, and it's not beyond the rest of the humans, and it's not beyond us. But it certainly requires a lot of effort, and all of the spiritual traditions of the world agree it's not an easy path, but it's one that's possible. It's one that is within human reach and within our own inner nature. So maybe the lesson might be patience with ourselves and even more so with others. So I hope that's at least a hint of an answer. It's about the best I can do at the moment, but great question. Good, thank you.
Well done. Thank you.